Our gospel reading for this morning comes from the 25th chapter of Matthew. It's a portion of the final teachings Jesus offers to his disciples prior to the events of his arrest and crucifixion. Jesus has been in Jerusalem for a few days now, or been there, and after his sort of last confrontation with any of his opponents in the temple, Jesus has returned that evening back to the Mount of Olives outside of Jerusalem, where these teachings take place. Listen for what the Spirit may speak to us through these words. Jesus said, "Then the kingdom of heaven will be like this. 10 bridesmaids took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. When the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them, but the wise took flasks of oil with their lamps. As the bridegroom was delayed, all of them became drowsy and slept. But at midnight there was a shout, 'Look, here's the bridegroom. Come out to meet him.' Then all those bridesmaids got up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish said to the wise, 'Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out.' But the wise replied, 'No, there will not be enough for you and for us. You had better go to the dealers and buy some for yourselves.' And while they went to buy it, the bridegroom came. And those who were ready went with him into the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later the other bridesmaids came also, saying, 'Lord, Lord, open to us.' But he replied, 'Truly I tell you, I do not know you. Keep awake, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour.'" The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. "Keep awake, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour." So says Jesus to his disciples in these final teachings offered just prior to his arrest and crucifixion. Some people have labeled this section, and ours being one small part of a larger section of teachings, as a second Sermon on the Mount, because it takes place on the Mount of Olives. And as with that first mountain sermon, Jesus sits down in the pose of a rabbi who will teach, and his disciples come to him to be taught. They ask him about the timing of God's coming new day and signs to look for. And Jesus speaks to them about difficulties and about suffering, but he doesn't give anything clear that would let you figure out an exact time. Jesus says, when it comes, you'll know it. But do not believe anyone who says they've figured out the date. Excuse me. Then Jesus tells a series of 4 parables, all in some way about his return and a final judgment. The first 2 are a pair that speak of awaiting that return, about wisdom and foolishness, and ours is the second in the pair, featuring wise and foolish bridesmaids. But exactly just what sort of wisdom Jesus is recommending here may not be immediately obvious. He says, keep awake. But both wise and foolish bridesmaids fell asleep. Now, typically, it's a bad idea to think of parables as allegories, but today's may be an exception. Jesus is the bridegroom whose return is delayed. And the bridesmaids, all of them, are those who follow Jesus and those who have made plans to celebrate with him at the glorious feast of God's new day, the great banquet that will come. That means that this parable is both about and for insiders, for followers. It means that this parable is directed at us, challenging us as to whether we are wise or foolish. But exactly what sort of wisdom is Jesus recommending to us by saying, carry oil? He says, stay awake, but wise and foolish both fall asleep. What is it Jesus is asking of us here? Now, there may be some hints for us in that first Sermon on the Mount. There's some things that appear in that sermon that reappear in the parable today. In both, there are those who say to Jesus, Lord, Lord, expecting to be welcomed and embraced in the kingdom, only to hear Jesus say, I do not know you. In that first Sermon on the Mount, those who call Jesus Lord, Lord, but he doesn't know, are those who have not done the will of God. And does Jesus mean for the lack of oil to somehow speak to this failure to do God's will? Apparently, the job of these bridesmaids was to provide a lighted procession from the family home of the bride to that of the groom, where the ceremony would then take place and his parents would host the great wedding feast. You see, weddings were the big social event in Jesus' day, and the party got started at the bride's home. People would arrive there and begin to party, and when the groom showed up, the whole wedding party then would journey to the groom's, led in this lighted procession by the bridesmaids. Now, in that first Sermon on the Mount, Jesus also talks about lamps and lights. He says, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Is Jesus saying something about these foolish bridesmaids, that they don't seem to recognize what is required of them? They don't realize the work they are to do? Is there lack of oil about being unaware of what the difficult work that is required of them? Perhaps. Now, some of you are no doubt already aware of that term woke and the phrase stay woke that you see on the bulletin, a phrase that has become associated with the Black Lives Matter movement. And if you've looked at that quote that's on the front of your bulletin, you've seen it defined in terms of black experience. But the term has also been appropriated by whites to describe their own recognition and rejection of white privilege, to proclaim themselves as allies. Now, quite understandably, some have objected to this appropriation of black culture by whites. And I don't want to do that. I'm perfectly content to go with the definition you have there, Oriana Corin's definition, that speaks of woke as a kind of awareness that is intrinsically tied to the challenge of navigating America in a black body. I'm perfectly happy to find some other way to speak of my own awareness of white privilege and systemic racism and my own desire to do something to help dismantle it. But at the same time, I think this term woke may capture something of what Jesus is demanding of us when he says, keep awake. When he says, keep awake, therefore. It's a powerful illustration of an awareness and an awakeness to the brokenness of our world that requires redemption and recreation. And I'm not going to borrow the term, but I am going to say Jesus is talking about something like this. Jesus expects much more of us than us to say we're aligned with him. He expects us, unlike the foolish bridesmaids who are aligned with him, to become animated by the hope and the promise of God's new day, by the hope of justice and equity and mercy, the hope that the lowly and the broken and the oppressed will be lifted up and set free. And so those of us who find new identities being in Christ discover that new person we are doesn't fit so easily into our world. Our new identities require us to become agents of transformation in a world that resists such transformation. Now, when I was working on this sermon, came across an article about white appropriation of that term woke. And I actually want to read just a small section of it to you. Not so much about the appropriation part, but you'll see. The most prominent pop touchstone of Stay Woke is Erykah Badu's, I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right, 2008 track, Master Teacher, in which she sings the refrain, I stay woke. Erykah brought it alive in popular culture, says David Stovall, professor of African American Studies at University of Illinois at Chicago. He says, she means not being placated, not being anesthetized. She brought out what her elders and my elders had been saying for hundreds of years. In turn, the track has helped shepherd the next generation into its own political consciousness. In an interview with NPR last year, the rapper Earl Sweatshirt described listening to Master Teacher in the car with his mother when he was a teenager. I was singing the hook like I stay woke, he says. His mother turned down the music, and she was like, no, you're not. What a wonderful illustration of the distinction Jesus is making between wisdom and foolishness. Have we become aware, fully awakened to the pain of the world that calls us to hunger and thirst for righteousness, to a new reality that arrives in Jesus that offers hope for the world? Or are we just saying the words? Are our lights shining in ways that point to the transformation of the world And are we in it for the long haul? Or are we just singing the song? Sometimes it seems to me that Christianity is sleepwalking, treating faith as though it were a couple of beliefs and being kind of moral, or as a generic spirituality that warms the heart a bit. But Jesus invites us to something so much more, to true awareness, to be truly awake, to be truly alive. Isn't that so much more, so much better, so much more real, so much more meaningful? Keep awake, says Jesus. Keep awake. All praise and glory to the God who comes in Christ to bring a new day, calls us to become agents of that new day. Thanks be to God.